Welcome to the Sustainable Production Forum. Hath squile each tenoyap, toits tanakquian quinshaman, cis quian sna, an hath in squalowin, an wanoxt in squalowin teetsies. Welcome everybody. It lifts my heart to welcome you to these ancestral lands and waters of the Huamathquiam, the Tsleil-Waututh, and the Squamish Oath Olcameo. I am Squamish and Stalo, and I'm standing on these shorelines where the salt water meets the shoreline and comes back into the forest with ancient trees, ancient cedar trees, ancient fir trees, and ancient maples. Welcome, OCM.
It's our job at CBC Radio-Canada to report on what we, as Canadians, care about. Politics, culture, sports, entertainment. But there's a bigger picture, something Canadians care about even more: the environment. It's what all the rest of it hinges on. We wouldn't be here without forests, wildlife, and oceans. Stories on the environment often have the way of making us feel powerless and small. Who are we against a hurricane? Who are we against a wildfire? Who are we against a changing climate? We are more powerful than it seems. So we're not just going to report on the environment. We're going to take action and help preserve all the things we care about. We've looked at how we can do better and set some goals for 2026. And that's just the beginning. Our ultimate goal is carbon neutral. As we move towards zero, we will report on our progress. Keeping you informed is our job, after all.
Ontario's film and television industry is committed to a sustainable future. The Ontario Green Screen Initiative is a public-private partnership of industry leaders that have assembled to provide the tools, relationships, resources, and educational opportunities required to make real environmental change. Visit ontariogreenscreen.ca for more information about how you can take part.
Welcome to SPF 22. I'm Zena Harris, President of GreenSpark Group and Creative Director of the Sustainable Production Forum.
Hi, I'm Melanie Windle, Executive Producer of the Sustainable Production Forum. Thank you for being here with us. I'd like to thank Cease Weiss for that wonderful traditional welcome. I'm tuning in from the traditional territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy, Siksika, Kainai, and Piikani, the Tsuut'ina Nation, the Nakota Nations, the Métis Nation Region 3 in the Treaty 7 region of Southern Alberta.
Today, I'm tuning in from the traditional territories of the Puyallup and Coast Salish peoples of the Puget Sound area. This virtual event is coming to you from around the globe. And if you are unsure of whose traditional land you are watching us from, you can visit native-land.ca or indigenousworld.org to learn more. Those links should be popping up in the chat shortly. Please share with us in the chat where you are tuning in from.
We are so excited to welcome you back to the 7th Annual Sustainable Production Forum. It's a delight to gather again. For the better part of 2022, Zina and I have been discussing your pain points, your successes, and figuring out how we can have an impact and move the needle in decarbonization in our sector.
We have been meeting with leaders, experts, change makers, and disruptors for the last 6 weeks, having incredible conversations, and we are excited to share them with you throughout the month of October.
If you have occasion to be in Vancouver, Toronto, or New York City, don't forget to check out our in-person events. Please introduce yourself. We love seeing the community grow.
Something special about SPF is that it is a gathering place for stakeholders across the entertainment industry, and we are very grateful for the support, collaboration, and allyship we have developed with our partners.
The SPF 22 lead partners are presenting partner, Real Green, Creative BC, Motion Picture Production Industry Association. Platinum partner, MBS Canada. Signature partners, CBC Radio-Canada and Telefilm Canada. Please visit our website or check out our sponsor page on the event platform to get to know all our partners and vendors.
A bit of housekeeping. Please take an opportunity to engage with the community board, to post or take our polls during sessions. Say hello to our partners and vendors. Please help us gather important measuring points by participating. Join the social media conversation by using the hashtag SPF22.
Hello, and welcome to The Heat is On, Emissions, Health, and Climate in this Decisive Decade. Like smoking and vaping, breathing diesel fumes puts human health at a greater risk for respiratory illnesses such as asthma and lung cancer, and can cause heart attacks. Not only does fossil fuel combustion impact our climate and planet negatively, it has serious health implications for humans. Joining us for this important conversation is Dr. Melissa Lem, President-elect, Canadian Association of the Physicians for the Environment, and Naomi Oreskes, Henry Charles Lee Professor of the History of Science and affiliated Professor of Earth and Planetary Sciences at Harvard University. And leading this important conversation is moderator Navjot Hundle, Senior Policy and Planning Analyst, Air Quality and Climate Change, Metro Vancouver. Welcome, everybody.
I guess to start off our conversation, it would be great to hear from you about how your work intersects with climate change and sustainability. Perhaps, Naomi, we can start with you.
Well, thank you. Thanks for the opportunity to be here today. So I'm a historian of science. I study the development of scientific knowledge. And for about 20 years now, I've been tracking the development of knowledge about the climate system, and especially tracking disinformation. So I study people who don't want us to understand the science, who stand in the way of public understanding of scientific findings because it's in their own vested political or ideological interest.
Thanks, Naomi. Perhaps I can pass it over to Melissa as well.
Sure, thanks, Nav, and it's great to be here. Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Melissa Lem. I'm President-elect of the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment and Director of Park Prescriptions for the BC Parks Foundation. And I'm also really passionate about education. So I've been appearing in the media as a medical expert for over a decade now, and appeared as a climate panelist on CBC Radio's Early Edition for the past year, and I'm currently the resident medical columnist on CBC TV News at 6 over here in Vancouver. So not only am I really passionate about improving our health by taking action on climate change, but also really passionate about communicating it to the public. And so we run a lot of campaigns through CAPE, from fossil fuel ad ban campaigns to opposing the expansion of fracked natural gas within BC, to running healthy climate solution fairs within Vancouver to try to mobilize the community. So there's a lot going on with CAPE, and I'm just proud to be a part of that organization.
That's great to hear, and so exciting to have you both here for this panel discussion as well on such an important topic. So I guess just to start off with this discussion about the intersection of climate change and human health, just as an opening question, what do you see as the human health impacts of climate change from your perspective and from the work that you do? Maybe pass it to Melissa to start off. Yeah.
Thanks. Well, the fact that climate change is affecting people's health is recognized by health organizations around the world. In 2015, so this is 7 years ago, the World Health Organization itself said that climate change is the greatest threat to global health of the 21st century. And it's certainly something that I've seen come to life in my own practice in this country and around the world since then. So last year, the West Coast was pummeled by extreme weather events and forest fires. We saw the heat dome that killed over 600 people in the space of 2 weeks, which was the most casualties of any extreme weather event in the history of Canada. I moved here to Vancouver with my family at the end of 2015, and the summer of 2016, I remember, was beautiful, like the summers Vancouver was famous for. It's so sunny, warm days for months with clear skies, but almost every year since then, we've had record-breaking wildfires and skies filled with smoke that are affecting people's mental health, cardiovascular health, and also their lung health, obviously. And then last year, the atmospheric river that hit in the fall was the most expensive extreme weather event in Canada's history. And it interfered with delivery of vaccines to the Lower Mainland and cut people off from access to dialysis and other forms of healthcare. And actually, in fact, the Canadian Institute for Climate Choices released a report that said if we don't rapidly cut our emissions, that by mid-century, climate change will cost our healthcare system in Canada over $100 billion per year. So I don't know about you, but especially with an aging population and higher rates of chronic disease, I'm not sure where our healthcare system is going to find $100 billion per year in under 3 decades. So this will impact patient care in huge ways if we don't take action now.
Mm-hmm. I think you touched on a really important piece there that, you know, we're seeing that trend now that we're having more of these extreme events, we're having more wildfire events, and they do have an impact on human health, and we have to look out for our vulnerable populations, but we also need to plan for that. And that's really resonating with the cost that it would have to the Canadian healthcare system. Yeah. Perhaps, Naomi, I can pass it on to you as well to see if you have any additional thoughts on how climate change is affecting human health.
Yes, well, one of the challenges we face in the climate change space is that many people don't really think of human health as the first thing that comes to mind when they hear the words climate change or global warming. And I think this is what people in my field would call an anchoring effect. That is to say, the problem was originally identified by physical scientists, physicists, atmospheric chemists, atmospheric physicists, climate modelers, who really framed the problem as a problem of the climate system and heat trapping gases, warming the planet. And you know, we often hear the language of saving the planet, right? I really resist that language. The planet will continue. It's not really about saving the planet, it's about saving us and all the diverse life forms on the planet. So I think the scientific community has been a little bit slow to really explain to people why this is so important for our lives, and particularly for our basic existence and health. Climate change threatens our lives. That's the bottom line. And a lot of scientists are afraid to say that because it sounds very dramatic and inflammatory, but it's the truth. Climate change makes wildfires worse. It makes hurricanes, typhoons, and cyclones worse. And it makes heat waves worse. And these things kill people. As the doctor just said, heat waves are deadly. Many people, older people particularly, but also younger people or people who are vulnerable in other ways, die of heat. Heat directly kills people. In hurricanes, we've seen just recently in Florida, most of the deaths in Florida came from drowning. Climate change makes the storm surge in hurricanes worse. There were areas of Florida that saw 29-foot storm surge. I mean, just think about that for a second, you know? I mean, I'm 5 feet tall. this is huge. And there's almost no way that you can get away from something like that if you haven't already evacuated. So we know that over 100 people were killed just in this one Hurricane Ian alone. Most of those people died by drowning, and that's an awfully terrible way to go. So there's the direct impact, and then there are all of the multiple of indirect effects associated with heart disease, respiratory diseases, as we just heard. Air pollution kills 8 million people every year. 8 million people. So think about that for a moment. And most of that air pollution comes from burning fossil fuels or from wildfires that have been made worse by climate change. So on so many levels, both direct deaths and then indirect deaths and illness, mortality and morbidity, climate change is a massive public health problem.
And I think you just touched on some really interesting points there, Naomi, or I guess concerning as well, but we can't parse out the environment from human health. They're so interconnected that it's just not possible. So if it's, I think in a lot of people's minds, it's something that's long-term or like they're disconnected from it. But in reality, it's just not the truth. The truth is we can't separate ourselves from the environment that we're living in and breathing in and working in. It's just not possible. So I think that's a really important point there.
Well, I could just jump back in on that. I think one of the really important things that we've learned in the course of my lifetime, when I was a child, people used to talk about nature or the environment as something that was out there. And people used to justify nature versus culture, or nature versus the human domain. But we live in the Anthropocene. We live in the era where human impacts are everywhere. And one of the things we've learned is that we are not separated from nature, and things that are bad for the planet are bad for us, and vice versa. And in some ways that's good, because it tells people, if you think you could just dump gigatons of carbon pollution into the atmosphere and not have that come back and affect us, think again.
Yeah. You know what I'd love to mention too, also about that idea that we're not separate from nature, and also getting people to think about how important it is for us to have a healthy environment, is that in fact, using the health frame to speak to people and encourage them to support policy proposals is one of the most effective ways that we can move them. Because there are all kinds of people in this world who don't really necessarily care about the polar bears or, some palm plantation or rainforest being cut down. But when you start to speak to them about their health, about their family's health, that's when they get mobilized. So there was this big study that was released last year that was a multi-country study, studied 5 different countries, over 7,500 people. And they asked them which frames would make them support policy proposals in terms of taking action on climate change. And in fact, it was health framing and in fact, opportunity framing that moved the majority of people. And in fact, people who weren't really concerned about climate change, they in fact were moved by the health framing and the opportunity framing the most. So when we can talk to people in terms of how it's going to affect their health, their family's health, and also all the positives that will come out of action on climate change, that's when we'll see the most people moved and build the most population support.
Definitely. And I think maybe for the viewers listening into this panel, it'll be interesting to hear like what are those health impacts that are caused by the direct combustion of fossil fuels, because we know that there's air contaminants that are associated with combusting fossil fuels, but might not be something that comes top of mind when we're talking about fossil fuels and climate change. So yeah, what are some of those health concerns that you see from your perspective? Melissa, maybe we can start with you.
I kind of want to turn that question on its head, because we've heard from Naomi about all the different air pollution impacts of climate or of burning fossil fuels on our health. So I want people to also think about the health risks to local populations where fossil fuels are extracted. So for example, right here in British Columbia, over 90% of our natural gas comes from hydraulic fracturing, which is a process where you inject toxic chemicals, sand, water under high pressure into deep wells in the earth, crack the earth to release these natural gas deposits. And there's evidence that, for example, hydraulic fracturing increases rates of pediatric leukemia nearby, increased rates of birth defects. There are also higher rates of early mortality in elders who live downwind from these hydraulic fracturing sites versus upwind of them. So there's a lot of evidence indicating that these toxins get released into the air, into the land, into the water, and they're affecting people's health. So when, for example, say you're on a set, you're in the kitchen or whatever, and you're turning on the natural gas to cook whatever it is on the stove, you're turning on natural gas that's coming from these areas that are harming people's health. And then we also want to think, in fact, about the indoor health risks of combusting natural gas, for example. So there's evidence showing that children who live in homes with natural gas stoves have a 42% increased risk of asthma, which is similar to living with a smoker. And so we're not thinking about all the different health harms that along the supply chain, from where it comes, where it's fracked in northern BC, for example, all the way to where it's burned in our homes. We're not thinking about the overall health impacts over and above just what we see, the smog that we see from internal combustion engine vehicles burning fossil fuels, or the diesel generators that create electricity or create power for trailers on set, for example.
Yeah, that's a really important point. There's so much more to the way that we get to combusting the fossil fuels that's not being considered. So yeah, I appreciate you highlighting that there's upstream impacts too, and there's toxins that are being released and affecting human health, just even beyond combustion. Yeah, thanks for that perspective, Melissa. Naomi, do you have anything more to add just on what the health impacts are from fossil fuel combustion? I think you did speak to air contaminants. Is there anything specifically?
I think that what Dr. Lem said is super important. It's something that people don't understand, I think, a lot. So scientists sometimes talk about what we call life cycle analysis, which is the whole life cycle of a product, from the very beginning when you first start exploring for oil and gas to the very end when you put that gas in your car or turn on gas in your stove in your home. And at every step of the way, there is damage. And especially, I'm so glad you raised the issue of natural gas, which is methane, which is one of the most powerful greenhouse gases there is. So much of our conversation about so-called emissions, I prefer to call it pollution. Emissions sounds geeky and technical. Pollution is what it is. So much carbon pollution discussion is focused on carbon dioxide, and there's good reason for that, which we can get into if we want to. But methane, natural gas, is 80 times more powerful. And we've seen big increases in methane releases associated with fracking all around the globe. Also, natural releases from the Canadian Arctic and other places. As the planet warms, natural methane is released from the permafrost, and this then amplifies the effect. So in so many ways, this whole thing ramifies and intercalates. So no matter where you live, you are affected. You might think, oh, if I live in the Arctic or I live in some pristine part of British Columbia, I'm not affected, but all of us are affected. And at every stage, there are health and environmental impacts. And I think, sometimes when I think about gas, I get angry because I'm a child who grew up with advertising campaigns that said, now you're cooking with gas. And I remember my mother saying that as a phrase that meant, now you're on track, now you're doing it right, now things are good. And gas has been touted for more than 50 years as a clean fuel, and it is not clean. True, it's not as bad as coal. Coal is even worse. Although from the greenhouse gas perspective, actually, arguably gas is worse, but it's not clean. It's incredibly damaging. And we've recently learned that even having a gas stove in your home is associated with inhalation of leakage, which can cause ill effects. And that's the other thing about gas that people, if you stop and think about it, it's really common sense. It's a gas. It gets out. There is leakage at every step of the way. There's leakage in the from the fracking. There's leakage in wells that have been abandoned after a field has been fracked. There's leakage in pipelines. We've seen pipeline explosions here in Massachusetts, where I live, that killed people and destroyed homes. There's leakage in your home. There's leakage from your stove. I mean, it just goes on and on and on. And the net result of all of this is to make it very clear that we have to stop using fossil fuels.
Mm-hmm. And I think too, it just specifically in the film industry, there's a lot of diesel use as well. And I know there's numerous health impacts related to that. So I'm wondering if you're able to speak to what that does to human health when you're in close proximity to diesel emissions, or sorry, pollution.
Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, it's burning fossil fuels, and it's if you can imagine standing in front of the exhaust pipe of a car and breathing it, that's what you're breathing when you're breathing in the fumes from a diesel generator. So 1 in 5 people around the world die because of air pollution generated from fossil fuels. Here in Canada, it's estimated anywhere from 14,000 to 32,000 people die prematurely from air pollution caused by burning fossil fuels. So it's, I mean, and if you think about, again, in your home, burning gas, it's not good to burn, it's not good to breathe anything that's combusting, and that's a fossil fuel. So in general, whether it's school buses burning diesel or whether it's generators in the circus, you know, on set, it's just not good for us to breathe burning things that are fossil fuels.
Yeah, it's such a, it's, I guess, just not something that we consider when we're burning those things, but you're right. It's just similar to being in front of an exhaust. Like, you know, there's pollution coming out of there that is harming to your health. And I guess maybe this kind of leads to a scenario I wanted to compare to. So I think we saw through several years, we've had smoking campaigns to try to really get people to understand the health impacts associated with smoking. And that's had a really positive impact in the sense that it's led to, we're seeing it's led to a reduction of smoking within populations. So we've been talking a lot about the health impacts of fossil fuel combustion, upstream and downstream, and climate change. Do you think that we could have similar campaigns for climate change? And do you think it could have a similar impact if we focus on human health?
I'll jump in on this if I may. So we already have those campaigns. I mean, across the globe in North America, there are many organizations that have run campaigns to educate people about climate change. But what we face is a giant uphill battle because of an onslaught of disinformation from the fossil fuel industry. And I have to say, this is particularly pertinent in Canada, where you have the worst fossil fuels of any type, which is the Alberta tar sands. They're incredibly dirty, incredibly polluting, incredibly damaging to the communities around them, upstream, downstream, and all around. But we are bombarded with campaigns by the fossil fuel industry telling us that we need fossil fuels, telling us that they're fighting energy poverty as if they ever cared about poor people, telling us we can't live without energy, which is a half-truth because it's true. We do need energy, but we don't need energy from fossil fuels, telling us that gas is a bridge fuel, telling us that carbon storage is the solution. I mean, the list of lies, misrepresentations, half-truths, cherry picking, it goes on and on and on. And we have been facing this for 30 years. Many people watching this are probably too young to remember, or maybe never even knew, but the United States and Canada are both signatories to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is an international law in which countries promise to take action to stop the pollution that drives climate change. 1992, that's 30 years ago. We have had a huge amount of time to deal with this problem. So why haven't we? Well, it's not just one thing. It is a complicated issue, but one of the major reasons has been fossil fuel obstructionism. And many people have been reluctant to call this out because it's hard, it's difficult. It's not nice to have to say that person is lying to you. But unless you do say that, people will not understand. And we have a lot of research now on this issue that if the fossil fuel industry is bombarding us with disinformation and scientists come along with information, that produces a kind of stalemate. Most people don't know what to think. And in the confusion that ensues, they just keep on doing what they're doing. People will not change if they're not persuaded of the need for change. I mean, even if you are persuaded, change is hard. But what we have found in our research and research of colleagues, that if you explain to people that this is disinformation, if you explain that this is essentially a con game, that the fossil fuel industry wants us to be at the losing end of a con game, that they want to make billions of dollars in profits while we get sick and die from what they have done, then people begin to move. So it's a complicated space, and I think it's a both and solution. We need to tell people that fossil fuels hurts their health. We also need to tell them that the fossil fuel industry has been lying to them about this, and it's time to break through those lies so we can fix this problem and protect everyone on this planet.
Yeah, I want to say amen to everything you're saying.
you.
Naomi, it rings so true to, to what we're trying to do with CAPE and what we believe. So something I think that's really interesting about tobacco campaigns and fossil fuel campaigns and advertising is they're so analogous in terms of their strategies. So if you think about the tobacco industry, they knew about the health harms of their products for decades, yet they ran all sorts of campaigns to try to convince the public that cigarettes were healthy, that they were actually good for your heart, that they were good for your throat. And then when all of these health harms started emerging and became very clear, then they started to shift to strategies which said, oh, smoke light cigarettes because they're better for your health, or cigarettes with filters or whatever. And so we can see similar things happening with the fossil fuel industry. For decades, they tried to convince us that climate change wasn't happening. And now that the results are incontrovertible, we're having atmospheric rivers, we're having heat domes that are killing people. Now they're shifting. They're saying, okay, well, now maybe we should shift to greenwashing. Now we'll try to, show videos and pictures of windmills and trees when we're talking about extracting fossil fuels. And so actually I want to say that CAPE has launched a campaign, a fossil fuel ad ban campaign called Fossil Fuel Ads Make Us Sick. And it's run by our amazing staff and supported by our board. And it's actually the first health professional-led campaign in the world to ban fossil fuel ads. And do you know what I'm actually really proud of about this campaign is that it isn't just a campaign of environmentalists, which you often think of when you think about people who are anti-fossil fuels. It was endorsed by the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons of Canada. It was endorsed by the Canadian College of Family Physicians. And these represent every single physician in the country. These are mainstream health organizations that recognize the impacts that unhealthy products like fossil fuels and advertising that increases demand for them have on our health. And so through this campaign, so keep an eye on it. The website is, I think it's www.fossilfueladsmakeUssick.ca. Anyway, we're asking for 3 things. So number 1, a comprehensive ban on advertising by fossil fuel industries, products and services, and internal combustion engine vehicles. Number 2, we're asking for a robust regulatory response to address misleading environmental claims by fossil fuel companies. So we actually just in the last month or so launched a complaint to the Competition Bureau about false claims by the natural gas industry that their products are clean and affordable. And number 3, we're also asking that there be regulations mandating the disclosure of the health and environmental risks associated with fossil fuel production and use. So especially within Canada, the health sector is really starting to mobilize on this disinformation and also educating people about the health risks of burning fossil fuels.
Yeah, if I can jump in, this is so great. Thank you, Dr. Lem, because Dr. Lem has just given me an opportunity to make a shameless plug for my book, Merchants of Doubt, which is exactly about this. So my co-author, Eric Conway, and I were among the first people to point out this connection between fossil fuel disinformation and the history of tobacco disinformation. And what we discovered in our work was it wasn't just that they were using the same strategies, it was actually that they were the same people. So a set of people who had worked with the tobacco industry, who had developed the tobacco industry strategies and tactics, then transferred over into climate change disinformation. Now, those original people are now dead, but their strategies, their tactics, the frameworks that they built are alive and well and living in Alberta and all around the world. And so I think this is very important. It's not just an analogy, it's a model. And it tells us, first of all, that we can identify disinformation and call it out and make people aware that they are being misled. But also, as Dr. Lem just suggested, it also gives us models for action. I often find that when I speak to people, they'll say, oh, this problem is so big, it gives me a headache. There's nothing I can do. But actually, there's a lot we can do. And one of the things we know from the history of tobacco is that there are solutions that work. So banning tobacco ads, I love the fact that you're fighting to ban misleading fossil fuel ads. I think that would be a huge step in the right direction. We know that banning ads help to decrease smoking among young people. And we also know that if you don't start smoking by the time you're about 25, you won't smoke. So anything that stops young people from smoking is super helpful. An abrupt, robust regulatory framework, absolutely important. Regulations mandating disclosure of harms were hugely important in the tobacco space. And of course, the other thing that was really important in tobacco were tobacco taxes. If you raise the price to the consumer, it sends a strong signal that this is not such a great thing, and you might want to look at alternatives. And we desperately need that in the fossil fuel space. Fossil fuels are unrealistically or dishonestly cheap because all of the health costs are put on other people. It's what economists call externalizing the costs. So there are all these costs associated with fossil fuel that get transferred to other people. But if you put heavy taxes on fossil fuels, then the price the consumer pays is more comparable with the true cost of these products. So there are a lot of things we learned from tobacco that we can apply in this space. It's not hopeless. There are things we can do, and we know that these things can make a difference.
Yeah, these are some great perspectives. And Melissa, it's so great to hear that there is a campaign out there about the misinformation about fossil fuel use. So I'm so glad to hear that. And Naomi, I've actually read your book as well, Merchants of Doubt. It rang a bell for me from my university years. So
Thanks.
yeah, so I think we've talked a lot about ads and misinformation around fossil fuels. But I guess we have a lot of content creators listening in. Is there anything that you think content creators can do when it comes to TV and film related to the representation of fossil fuels? Similar to smoking, we saw that, smoking's kind of, it can be represented as, the bad guys in movies are the ones that smoking, or we're seeing it less and less within content. Is there something that content creators can do to really emphasize the negative impacts of fossil fuels?
Well, I think there's a huge amount that content creators can do, because this is really the story of our lifetimes. I mean, we are now living in an incredibly difficult story, right? When people started burning fossil fuels, they didn't know that it was going to warm the planet and do this huge amount of damage to people, plants, animals, property, everything. But starting around the 1950s, they began to know, and by the 1980s, they definitely knew. And yet we've been unable to do anything meaningful to really stop this problem. And so there are a lot of stories to be told there. There are stories about science, there are stories about medicine and health, there are stories about the fossil fuel industry and its obstructive practices, there are stories about communities fighting back. There are stories of individuals like Dr. Lem and myself. So, there's a huge amount of great content that could be turned into terrific stories. And then there's also the question of how the fossil fuel industry is portrayed. The fossil fuel industry is sort of in the background of our lives. There are very few films or television shows that I've ever seen that actually confront this industry and what it's done. But there's a whole lot of stories to be told there that are really great stories, dramatic stories, worrisome stories. They could be great documentaries, they could be great feature films. So yeah, and then I also want to make one more shameless plug, which is the documentary version of my film, Merchants of Doubt, which if you don't want to read the book, the film is available. A lot of documentarians have tried to make films, and frankly, it's been hard until pretty recently to get the funding and finance to do documentaries on this subject. But I think that's changing, because I think increasingly people are realizing that this really is the single biggest story of our times.
Mm-hmm. One point I want to make is that when we tell these stories, we have to be really careful not to demonize the workers, because we really should be focusing negative attention on the industry itself, because these are people who helped build our economy, right? For decades, they made money, they contributed tax dollars. The fossil fuel industry contributed tax dollars. We are a resource-based economy here in Canada. And so we have to make sure that we're not demonizing, we're not portraying oil and gas workers on a rig or whatever as these evil people. We want to make sure that we're portraying the industry itself as the problem. Something else I think we need to think about, kind of with that idea about how the bad guys now smoke and the good guys don't. Maybe we can have the bad guys driving internal combustion engine vehicles, with the exhaust coming out their tailpipes. Maybe we can have the bad guys cooking with gas, whereas the good guys are cooking with induction, or driving those EVs, for example, or doing jobs in the clean industry. So there are all kinds of ways, in subversive ways, that we can portray the good guys as representing the future that we want and we need, and the bad guys as representing the past.
Yeah, and one more thing on that about the workers, it's such a tricky issue, because at some point we all do make choices about how we're going to make our livelihoods. But as you say, there are many people who live in communities where there aren't really a lot of other alternatives. But again, one thing, parallel to the tobacco industry, one thing we know about the tobacco industry, because we've read the documents to prove it, is that the tobacco industry lied to its own workers. they denied the harms of their product to the people who were making and selling these products. And one of the most telling documents I've ever come across when I was doing this work was a document where a Philip Morris executive says, we have to make sure that our salesmen don't know this, right? Because they knew that if the salesman really understood how deadly this product was, at least some of those salesmen might start looking for other jobs. And I think there's a parallel in the fossil fuel industry. It's not easy if you live in a town where coal mining is the only game in town, but not all fossil fuel workers are in that situation. And I think that when people understand how truly bad this is, at least some of them will begin to think about making other choices.
And there's definitely a move among the oil and gas industry to want to move to a clean economy. They see the writings on the wall. They see the targets that different countries are embracing to reduce carbon pollution. And they've realized that this industry is not going to be here for the long haul. And they also want to contribute to a better, cleaner future. And so the unions themselves are calling out for a just transition. They're calling out for investments from government to actually help them pave the way towards these cleaner economy jobs. So it's a call that's coming from within the industry itself, which is something really positive that I'm happy to see.
Yeah, for sure. And I think this touches on a really important point that I'm noticing in policy is around, we have this huge issue with climate change and fossil fuel combustion, but at the same time, we're facing other issues within our communities around affordability and equity and jobs. And job security. So, it's definitely something that we have to think about of how we're talking about the different parts of fossil fuel creation, because we do have people that have that as their job security currently. So, yeah, I think that's touches on a really important piece that there is an uphill battle there when we're thinking about policy creation, where we're trying to do this transition to cleaner sources of energy, but we need to do it in a way that's a just transition, and we're not leaving people behind, I think. So, yeah.
If I could jump in on that too, and of course, I absolutely agree with what you just said, but we also have to be really careful when we talk about affordability, right? Because the fossil fuel industry exploits that and wants us to think that renewable energy is too expensive. And that's not true. I mean, first of all, you have to ask yourself the question, why do fossil fuels appear to be cheap? Well, they appear to be cheap because, as I said a few minutes ago, a lot of the true cost is hidden. They're incredibly subsidized. Virtually every major fossil fuel country in this world subsidizes their fossil fuel industry. The World Bank estimates that direct subsidies to fossil fuel production is about $500 or $600 billion every year. And that's just the direct subsidies, the tax credits, the tax incentives. It does not include all the health costs that Dr. Lem was talking about. If you throw in the indirect subsidies in unpaid health costs, then it's more than $1 trillion every year. So fossil fuels are not cheap, but they appear to us to be artificially cheap because of a whole set of really perverse policies. And even with all those subsidies, it's now the case that renewable energy is cheaper in almost every country in the world. Renewable energy costs less. And I've really noticed this in the last few months with the price of gas going up. A lot of journalists have been saying, oh, the price of energy is skyrocketing. No, the price of energy is not skyrocketing. The price of renewable energy is falling. It's the price of oil and gas that's going up. And so we really need to break that apart and remind people, as long as we're trapped in a fossil fuel framework, it will feel to us like energy is getting more and more expensive, and we'll be really worried about inflation and affordability. But if we refocus our attention on renewable energy, we realize it's actually a good deal economically, as well as from the point of view of the environment and health and so many other things.
And when people think about affordability as well, they're focusing on right now. And analysis after analysis has showed us that if we invest in mitigation and adaptation strategies, it is going to save us billions, trillions of dollars down the line than if we don't act. And I also want to point out to people that if you think about having a functional healthcare system, which I work in, our healthcare system only determines about 20 to 25% of our overall healthcare status. And the rest comes from having healthy and functional social and structural determinants of health. And below those underlie healthy and functional ecological determinants of health. And so I realized that the majority of what I do in my job, in my day job, is not responsible for my patient's health. It's everything outside of it. So if we can make housing more affordable and secure, if we can make sure our air is clean to breathe, healthy education, food security, and then underlying that, we require a healthy environment to make sure those things can happen, then we'll realize what true affordability is. And we'll realize that, in fact, shifting away from fossil fuels is far more affordable than the alternative.
Yeah, and I think it would be great to hear, like, just from your perspectives, what would a world that is without fossil fuels look like? What do you see as the positive impacts, or just generally the impacts, if we have cities that are not reliant on fossil fuels?
Well, there's no question it would be way better. I mean, there are so many architects, design people. I have a lot of design students who are taking my classes now because the world of design is really on this issue, because they recognize that so much of our dependence on fossil fuels is partly by design, both big D design and little d design. So our homes, how much energy our homes use, how much light is partly a function of design. And this is certainly true of cities, particularly in the United States. So many of our cities have been designed around automobile transportation. And again, back in the 1950s, that seemed like a good idea. I lived for many years in San Diego, which is a totally driving oriented city, and I loved it and I was happy there, but it doesn't have to be that way. And if we begin to think about designing cities that aren't so reliant on automobiles, we find they're better cities. They're better places to live. People's health improves. People get out and walk more. People can interface with other people and have better social relations. So these are really win-win-win solutions, but we have to get there from here. And that's really the challenge. It's not to envision how we could have a better life on renewable energy. It's to figure out how we make that transition from the frameworks that are holding us back right now to a different kind of framework that lets us move forward. I sometimes think about, in the United States, there was a political slogan that was famous, a chicken in every pot. And what I like to think is solar panels on every roof.
And I think, just speaking from a personal perspective, my 7-year-old is acutely aware, because he grew up around me, about the health harms of fossil fuel combustion. And so he, for example, when we walk down a street and he smells the exhaust from a fossil fuel burning vehicle, he says, "Mommy, gross, ew," like, why aren't they driving an electric vehicle, or why aren't they biking, or whatever? So from a personal perspective, I'll hear far less from my 7-year-old if we shift towards healthier cities. But also we have to think about all the co-benefits of climate action. So not only will this prevent our Earth from heating and our social systems, our structural systems from breaking down, but it'll also have so many co-benefits from our health. Like, people, if there's more active transportation corridors for biking, walking, and rolling, people's hearts will be healthier. They'll have better mental health. They'll have better respiratory health because they won't be breathing fumes, and they'll be exercising. If we have more green spaces, if we have more green corridors where people can walk through and connect with each other, that'll be better for our air quality, because in many cases, these green spaces absorb air pollutants, and also will be more socially connected and healthier because spending time in green space is better for us. So we have to think about, it's a double-barreled win for us, in that we're slowing down heating, but we're also improving our health and society at the same time.
And
that makes me think of something. When I was younger, industry people used to like to accuse environmentalists of being tree huggers. But now science has proven that hugging a tree is good for you, and that trees make us healthier and happier. So we should love trees because trees love us back.
Yeah, Naomi, that's a good point. I think, Melissa, I've heard that there's now prescriptions for spending time in nature. Would you be able to speak a little bit to that as well?
Yeah, well, okay, so I haven't talked about this at all, and this is actually my first love, which is nature and health. So I've been advocating at this intersection for over a decade now, and I really started getting into this area when I had my own nature and health deficit crisis, moving from northern BC, where I was a full-service rural family doctor surrounded by bears, mountains, rivers, you name it, where I could de-stress, and then moving back to downtown Toronto, where I was born, and suddenly being surrounded by concrete and glass and skyscrapers, and feeling so much more stressed, even though the work itself was far easier. And that led me to discover this huge body of evidence behind the health benefits of nature, that I thought, oh my goodness, like, I haven't heard about this. My colleagues aren't talking about this. No one is talking about this. So I need to make sure that everyone knows. And so fast forward to 10 years later, in November 2020, through the BC Parks Foundation, we launched PARX, which is Canada's National Nature Prescription Program. And it's now spread to every province in Canada and features over 10,000 regulated health professionals registered in our program to prescribe nature. And this includes over 5% of all practicing physicians in the country, which I think is huge because we know that physicians are notoriously small c conservative when it comes to adopting new practice innovations. And so the fact that we have over 5% in under 2 years is incredible. But I will note that it started in the US first. So the first National Nature Prescription Initiative was ParkRx America, which was founded, I think, 2018 or something like that. So we really have been inspired by colleagues in other countries to launch this nature prescription initiative. But something I will point out on the topic of sustainability is that not only are we trying to improve people's individual health and community health, but also improve planetary health. So there's research showing that people who are more connected to nature across the lifespan are more likely to engage in pro-environmental behaviors. So that doesn't only extend to conservation, which totally makes sense because we protect what we love, but also they tend to recycle more, they tend to conserve more energy, they tend to vote more for climate action. So I like to think that every time someone in our program prescribes nature and connects a patient to nature, that they're doing something for the planet at the same time.
Yeah, that's honestly such a great initiative to hear about. And I guess as we're getting to the end here, I'd be interested if you guys have any final thoughts to share just around our conversations regarding climate change and health. And if you have any ideas in general of how those that are working in film and TV can make a difference. So yeah, just any closing thoughts that you have.
Well, I would just say that this is such a big issue that we all need to be involved in it, and that it's really incumbent on everyone, whether you're a filmmaker or whatever you do, to think about how you can be part of the solution.
Thanks, Naomi.
And I want to mention something that I don't usually mention because I often speak with health audiences, is that I actually used to act professionally. So I had an agent, I would go to auditions, I've been on sets, I've been in a number of Hollywood films actually. And something I realized when I was on set was that it's like this big family. You spend time with these people over weeks or months and you build connections. And so I think if you can build those connections and work together and realize, hey, there are different actions that we can take, that is really a powerful way to start to build action within your communities. And something else is that you are experienced communicators. You are compelling and you know how to speak to people's hearts and people's minds. So I think if you tell those stories and if you build community and you band together intersectorally. So for example, CAPE collaborated with members of Vancouver's artistic community this past summer, animators and artists, to actually launch a Healthy Climate Solutions Fair, where they in fact created original art to illustrate these stories about where we need to go in the future and how it's going to improve our health. That's incredibly compelling. So again, leveraging your experience as storytellers and communicators, banding with other people and getting the stories out there that we need to hear.
Great. Thank you so much, Melissa and Naomi, for your thoughts there and being a part of this really important discussion. So I think with that, we'll wrap up this session, but hopefully for anyone listening, you've taken some key points away from today's discussion and have a new perspective to think about regarding your health and quality of life when it comes to the conversation around climate change as well. All right, thank you, everyone.